Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, How Marketing Wins with the Data Layer. I'm your host today. My name is Brooke Larson and I am the Partner and Enablement Manager at Numeric Analytics. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please use the question panel on the GoToWebinar console to ask a question at any time during the webinar. Your lines are muted, but we will be checking for questions throughout the presentation. We actually have a lot of content for you today, so we are planning on 10 minutes for questions at the end. If we don't get to your question during the webcast, we will email you a response, so please don't feel forgotten. Finally, we will be sending you the recording and a copy of the slide deck by email tomorrow. We will send this to everyone that registered, even if you weren't able to attend. With that, I will get us started with the presentation. Numeric Analytics was formed in 2006 by a small contingency of analytics professionals that recognized the transformative power of analytics for companies of all sizes and the need for consulting services to support this paradigm shift. Today we work with digital marketing professionals who want to use advanced analytics and optimization to answer complex, high-value questions that drive revenue, customer experience, and profit. We have completed more than 3,000 analytics implementation projects. I would also like to introduce today's speakers. Matt Coors is as resourceful of a problem solver as you will ever find. He understands, oh, I think I have my timing on. 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. He understands programming. Oh, this is James. Let me go back to Matt. He understands programming deeply. He has founded a company as well as worked as a practitioner for many years. He's passionate about new cutting-edge technologies, but most importantly, he's the leader and mentor for our team of digital architects that solve problems for our customers every day. I would also like to introduce James Niehaus, Vice President of Strategy and Analytics at Insighten. Insighten has been a strategic partner of ours for a few years now, and we believe they have one of the best solutions in the marketplace for collecting your data, managing it, and most importantly, acting on it. James is a frequent speaker at digital marketing conferences and also brings with him significant real-world experience, like at Symantec, where James was prior to Insighten. He built one of the most advanced optimization programs in the industry from scratch, running 100+ concurrent tests each month, incorporating an advanced targeting, third-party data, and real-time predictive scoring. With that, I would like to hand it over to Matt to take you into today's presentation.
Thanks, Brooke. So, as analytics companies, we're all very accustomed to the collection of data and using that data to generate reports. But we know that there is much more that can be done, and quite frankly, the goalposts have changed over the last few years, causing us, meaning those of us working in analytics, either as consultants or in industry, to really need to improve our game and embrace a more sophisticated level of capabilities. What I'd like to talk today about is how organizations are starting to actually use data to drive their marketing initiatives, and how data layers really enable them to open up an entirely new sources of data that previously were less available. The purpose of this is to not only present the data and reports to the corner office, but to actually use our data in a tactical day-to-day way to make improvements in customer experience and to really begin to optimize the performance of the investments that you've been making. Next slide. So we often use the metaphor of the mechanic versus the racing team, where the mechanic is constantly trying to fix the squeaks and the knocking noises, whereas the racing team already has a working machine. And they're constantly pushing the performance envelope by testing small changes and making incremental improvements to their equipment and their processes. What we're seeing is that most organizations are generally somewhere in between these two extremes. They probably do spend more time than they'd like knocking down the bugs and the problems, but then again, they're also able to get their head above the water often enough to test out what they're doing and look for ways to make it better. Okay, next slide. And as it turns out, predictably, the racing team tends to win the race. So looking at the data from surveys as well as our own anecdotal feedback that we've been able to get from our clients that we work with, we can see that the scientific approach tends to work better over time. According to this 2013 study that Adobe did, only about half of organizations actually make testing a priority and use the tools they have available to support their decisions. Of those that don't make testing a priority, 60% convert less than 2% of their visitors. Whereas those that dedicate more significant resources to optimization, we found that 67% achieve more than 2% and 40% convert more than 5%, which is actually a pretty significant conversion rate. So without a doubt, when you look at the data, you can see a direct correlation between an organization's focus on optimization and increases in their conversion rates. If you think about the impact of diverting perhaps 25% of marketing spend optimization, then we would need to see a dramatic increase in conversion rates. But as you can see here, the case is pretty clear. As organizations increase their optimization efforts, conversion rates tend to go up significantly more than they invest. Okay, next slide. So data is necessary for testing and optimization. These types of improvements are only achievable by using and integrating data. And in a moment, James is going to expand on this idea a bit, but having the ability to step outside the confines of the out-of-the-box capabilities of the more traditional analytics solutions really helps to give these types of programs a whole new gear. So the enabling factor is integrating the digital behavior data with outside data sources and exposing information that may have previously been locked up in back-end systems or even in third-party tools. Obviously, we want to continue to have access to the web data, but what if we can add in new types of data, like information from customer databases, people's purchase history, their known product correlations, appended data that might come from third-party sources or like CRM systems and DMP systems, which stands for Data Management Platform. And then use that information to develop more sophisticated customer segments. This really helps us to more intelligently drive our testing and optimization programs. So how we gain access to this type of data and actually use it in a tactical way is what this presentation is going to be about. Okay, next slide. Portability of data. So data portability really refers to how easily we can move or use data from one system into another. We're going to talk about some specifics here, but the important thing to understand is that because we're leveraging data from various systems and using them in a single, more integrated application stack, we need to be able to condition and transform the data so that we can move it from one system to another and use it across the stack. Now, we're not going to actually put together an integration here today, but we are going to talk at a high level about the sorts of things that need to be done. Next slide. So let's start with talking about the problems with proprietary data. We know that we have various applications that need access to our data. Everything from our analytics beacons to optimization systems to simple conversion beacons. Some of these require more intensive programming and significant amounts of integration. Others are much more simple and may not allow much in the way of customization, but regardless, they all use data. And some can be made to be much more powerful if we can provide additional information to them. One thing that I've observed in working with my clients is that most organizations have at least 10 pixels or tracking beacons of some sort that they load on each page. In fact, I was reading an article just the other day that said that the average for most organizations is now over 20. If you have Ghostery, which is the little screenshot you see here, you can see this as you browse the web and you go on different websites. And for example, this one had 71 trackers when I was putting this slide together. But most systems will have, they'll have one or two analytics beacons. They'll have an email beacon. They might have some affiliate beacons. They might be running some ad networks or remarketing campaigns. So while 10 or 20 beacons is very common, I've also seen much more. In fact, I've seen a few that have 50 and some that even have over 100. So that's a lot of beacons, and every one of them has to be managed and sends at least some data somewhere. Now, this causes some predictable problems. The first problem is just simply redundancy of code. If you need to send a key piece of data, like for example the page name, to 5 or 10 different beacons, then traditionally that would mean repeating that code 5 or 10 times. We call this code bloat, and it's generally considered to be a sign of bad design. Another big problem that can be related to code redundancy is what I call mismatched definitions of data. So one of my favorite examples of this is to ask clients how they define revenue. I mean, it might seem obvious. Revenue is the income from your website. But nonetheless, you can usually ask 5 different people at the same company and get 5 different answers. You know, as an example, does revenue include sales tax? You know, here in North America, in the United States, generally you would say, well, maybe not. But if you sell internationally, in Europe, for example, they have a VAT tax, which includes the tax in the price of the product. So in that case, a lot of times it is considered revenue. So our developers working in EMEA sites, for example, are they defining revenue the same way as developers in North America? So the potential for differences in the definition of data points can cause apples to oranges comparison problems. And finally, if an organization is not using a common data layer, and instead has their definitions and data in a series of proprietary variables, they can become prohibitively expensive to reprogram these things if the organization needs to switch platforms or share data between systems. Next slide. So data layers and tag management to the rescue. Data layers are huge for solving a lot of these types of problems that I've just laid out. You know, our goal is to stop some of the bad habits that we formed in the past as an industry, and instead we'll work out ways to make our data collection more robust. And James is going to talk in greater detail about how this can happen later on in the presentation. But the purpose of the data layer, as we've discussed, is to help us to separate the data from the specific tracking beacons or the tools you might be using. But it's also helpful to think of it as separating the data from the page content. You know, we don't want our tracking to break if a designer changes some page code that we were using to identify the page's headline, for example. And so the data layer helps us to build a more robust solution that allows us to make more apples-to-apples comparisons across packages and even link data collected from different systems together so that they're all using the same data layer to collect their data. This globally available object, therefore, makes it much easier to add new packages and even TMS systems. For example, if you're thinking about implementing your first TMS right now, going ahead and getting the ball rolling on getting a data layer put together now will make the process that much more seamless when it comes time to actually implement the new solution. And then just as importantly, if you decide to take a package or tool out of your website, it's much easier to remove them since they aren't hard-coded into the application. You know, it helps to reduce the risk of trying new things, which is so important in marketing. You know, when you don't have as much expense either on the implementation side or on the expense of removing the tool later if you decide you're not going to use it. Next slide. So let's talk about the next challenge. You know, data doesn't just come from web browsers and mobile apps. We have data everywhere. And the question is, how do we rise to the next challenge and actually use the data we have at our disposal in our analytics packages and other types of systems? In tag management, what we see is the more forward-thinking solutions like Insighten have the ability to collect and utilize data, you know, outside of analytics. For example, data that's in our optimization platforms or our customer databases, you know, our data in our DMPs, like I talked about, the data management platforms. And there are even third-party data sources that can be purchased to augment data that we have in any of these systems. So the question is, if we have access to these other data sources, how can we leverage them to learn more about the way users engage with our applications, and what can we do to optimize their experiences? Next slide. One thing that we need to kind of clear up here, it's a little bit of a technical slide here, but it's important to understand the difference between client-side and server-side, because we hear a lot about this as we move into the more complicated questions about data layers. So one of the things that's really important to understand, so this, when we get into the exploitation of these new type of data, is when we're adding on the server-side capability. We talk about these things quite often in conversations with our clients because oftentimes in order to make use of this type of information, you have to understand that they're actually collected and are able to be used in different places. So client-side is all the code and data that's available in the user's browser or mobile app as they're using it. It uniquely has access to their behavior that's not really visible to the server application. On the downside, client-side data is very time sensitive since everything has to be presented in a seamless way to the user. And this is the type of data that most analytics packages have traditionally tracked. So this is things like the page name of the page that the viewers, users viewing, the percentage of a video that was viewed, or how a user's filling out a conversion form, or even how far they might scroll down the page. This is user behavior data. Server side is all the code and the data that's used to generate the client-side experience, and even can include data that hasn't historically been used to generate the experience, which is kind of our point here. Some examples of server-side data might include user IDs, purchase history information, someone's contact information, other types of augmented data that you might purchase from a third-party source. So all of this could potentially be sent to a client-side optimization tool to really improve the customer experience. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I want to expand on server-side data. It's important to keep in mind that everybody has already for years now been collecting client-side data. And so what we're really talking about here is potentially having the ability to add on server-side and third-party data through the data layer. The important thing to understand is that there's much more data available server-side than there is client-side. So for example, I often talk about user IDs, but that's because they're so important. Many times what we're seeing is that when users log into websites, that user ID is oftentimes not available to the tracking scripts in the browser so that they can even pass it into the analytics system. And this is so important, particularly when we're trying to match data up or augment data on the back end. We need to understand who the individual is so we can link the data together. Now, purchase history is a really good example. Oftentimes, the back-end system has access to a user's purchase history. We know this because we often use it to generate content in the user's account information, like if they go to look at the products they've purchased and things like that. So why isn't this data available to the analytics system from every part of the website? Wouldn't it be important to know which product categories a user has purchased from in the past? And then there's appended data. So this would be information that an organization might purchase to understand additional information about the users. So this could be demographic data to understand a user's gender or age or income, or even psychographic data to help understand a user's values or their interests, and better understand their lifestyle. We might take a look at metadata, for example, about the user's session and the content that the user's seeing. This is kind of something that I've seen missing in a lot of implementations. A lot of times we're focused on collecting information about what the user did, but we may not be collecting enough information about what they actually saw. How might we, how could we use metadata about the data to categorize the content? We might also be interested in collecting additional, I'm sorry, can you go back? We might also be interested in collecting additional information about the user. So for example, we might have reasons to know geographic information, like their zip code or geolocation information for optimization programs. And then there's also some potential important information about the application. So for example, we might notice that the users are having trouble checking out, and it would be good to know that they were using, for example, a credit card application versus a PayPal checkout or something like that. Sometimes we even see issues in terms of geographic differences in where data is being served in terms of data centers. So being able to collect metadata about what's happening can be important even beyond simply looking at the behavioral data that we normally collect with client-side applications. Okay, I'm sorry. Now you can go to the next one. So how to talk to IT. In the past, data layers have usually meant, like I said, the client-side data that's used for behavioral tracking and analytics. Ironically, many companies are putting tag management systems in place as a way to escape the need to work with IT so much. But as I've just shown, there's this whole new world of data that can be opened up by working with IT. And one of the great things about this is when we talk about data layers, it's important to understand that this is the language that IT already speaks. So whereas IT may be accustomed to getting all these crazy requests from marketing about things they'd like to add to the website, in this case, this is really something that they're used to. All software and web applications use data objects on the back end already. And there's a lot of information that's already available. So the goal is to have a conversation about this and learn what's available and easy to get to. I put this picture of the marriage counselor here with a couple who may not be communicating very well, because I think it's a metaphor that probably pretty accurately describes what we often see going on within enterprises. It's important to keep the dialogue going, because in the end, we really do need each other, and many of the things we're doing now are very symbiotic between marketing and IT. Okay, next slide. So getting your foot in the data object door, the important thing is to understand that IT is a resource that you can tap into to get more valuable information. If the data exists in the back-end application, then it's theoretically possible to expose it to the client-side data layer. But we have to be careful about how we approach this. The first step is to establish an object that can be used by IT to move data from the server to the client. So when I talk about the client, I mean like the browser or the mobile app that's being used. Keep in mind that the data can usually be appended to an analytics package later. In fact, all the major players in terms of the analytics solutions allow data to be appended. But that won't help with testing and optimization programs that require the data to be present in the browser at the time that the user's on the site. So some CMS packages already have existing data objects that you can use or extend to hold the data you need. As an example, and this is just one example, but Adobe's AEM, Content Management System, can already expose what's called a client context variables in an object that they have called CQ Analytics. So it's a relatively easy effort to activate this object if it isn't already activated, and it exposes some potentially valuable information right out of the box. So often it's the case that there's already data that's available in an object like the CQ Analytics object, but marketing doesn't know the data is there, and IT doesn't necessarily know that the data is useful. So this is where the dialogue thing happens, right? So ask IT what data objects are available or can be easily exposed. Another important thing that I've seen is to not necessarily ask for everything all at once. Don't ask for 100 data points all at the same time and create some huge project, because that's one of the things that just kind of gets you put on the back burner. It's often, in my experience, better to keep things bite-sized and achievable. So as I said earlier, you can usually start with a user ID, because that's really one of the most important things, or create a linked user ID if IT pushes back on exposing the actual user ID. Just to kind of explain, IT will sometimes have a problem if you start asking them to expose the user IDs that are used in the back-end system, because this is an actual link to all the data about a user in the database. So they don't necessarily want to give something that could potentially be used by a hacker to exploit the system. So the way around that is to establish a special marketing user ID that's related to the actual user ID, but is only used for marketing purposes. It can still be used to link various systems together and join the data together on the back end. It's almost always the case that when you run up against problems getting to the data you need, you can usually get around it by knowing how to ask the right questions. And this thing about the user ID is really a good example of that. If you can't get the user ID, it's important to know that you can oftentimes just ask IT to create a marketing ID that you can use to accomplish your goal without introducing any security risks. So a couple more points to consider here. Once the data object exists, it's much easier to add new data points to it. It gives you a structure to build off of that's already moving data from the back end to the front end. So despite my picture here, it's much easier to expose a new data field to an existing object than it is to create a brand new one from scratch. So once you have that object, you might start adding on new data points, like once you have the client ID, you might start adding in their purchase history, or maybe just the categories, the products that they've bought in the past, or the last product they looked at or bought, or like I said, other information you might have, like their zip code or their gender, whatever it is that you need to really be able to optimize the user experience. And finally, you want to make sure that the data you do expose is not PII. And now PII stands for personally identifiable information. Now this is things like social security numbers, phone numbers, email addresses, that kind of thing. James is going to talk more about this here in a minute, but truthfully, that type of data is not really helpful from an analytics perspective, because the user ID or the marketing user ID, whatever you have, is ample to match back to whatever you have in your database. Exposing PII can open you up to all kinds of problems, not the least of which is that it violates the terms of service for most of the major analytics companies, but in some places it's actually against the law. So you want to be careful about that. So see, I think that's all I have.
Great. Thank you, Matt. This is James, and I want to kind of take the next 20 minutes or so and kind of bring this to life for marketers. So I think Matt did a great job of kind of giving an overview of data layers and really best practices about both how to design one as well as how to work with your internal teams to execute and make that possible. But really, what's it mean for the marketer at the end of the day? So really, marketing is all about data. Next slide. When you think about the right marketing, right? Whether it's right person, right time, right offer. And this SAS diagram kind of gives a great breakdown of really all the different factors that go into delivering that right marketing experience across channels. If you want to achieve the right marketing, as you see from each line item, all that requires the right data, right? So you need to really be able to create a single view of your users. That view needs to be real time, so you can personalize experiences on the fly. It needs to be very granular in terms of detail, so you can know their behaviors and how they interacted with your brand at what touch point. It has to be across channels and devices, so you can actually deliver this, omni-channel experience that's probably your charter as an organization going forward. But it all really comes down to the fact that data is foundational. So next slide. So more than anything, I think the last couple of years, marketing has woken up to the reality, which is for marketeers to be successful in their role, they need to kind of, wrestle with and really gain, knowledge and control over how data is collected, and make it foundational to their really marketing objectives, right? So it has to be trustworthy, comprehensive, and available, and scalable. So really drive all your marketing programs on your own, on your own properties as well as what you paid for and what you've earned, right? Data is going to drive all those really advanced use cases around targeting the user experience to the right user. So this is why next slide, data. The data layer is so foundational for digital. So it's not just driven by TMS. It's become a best practice in the industry. It's become a standard across mostly all organizations. Now, obviously, tag management platforms like Insight make it much easier to enable and scale. But really, it's become a critical path and foundation for most marketing programs. And really, this is just a quick visual to help people just really, as a marketer, understand the simple but valuable role it plays. Like Matt mentioned, historically, marketers were configuring proprietary data feeds for each individual tag. So even though each tag wanted the same data, it would ask for it in a different kind of naming convention or taxonomy or structure. All the data layer really does is really removes that proprietary focus and really draws the focus really on designing a data structure that's built with your business in mind. So before you worry about what vendor gets what data point, you want to make sure as a business you define all the data that's valuable to your business to really run it at the end of the day, from KPIs to what's meaningful as far as key events, whether it be engagement or conversion or utilization, whatever is those key attributes that you're defining as a business first, and then from that point mapping that to your various technology tools that will evolve over time. So that's really just that quick visual. This really helps you kind of understand the data layer focus. But also, people often underestimate the amount of rich data that actually exists within your data layer. So if you just do a quick click on the slide, you kind of see just quick visually that there's so much rich data that's often generated in each visit, session, hit, whatever, how you want to define that scope or range, that really can all be considered valuable signals to drive your various marketing use cases. Once you start peeling back the data layer and really understand where data is coming from, whether it be from the user's device or cookies or from the back-end server side, like Matt mentioned, there is so much rich data that we often realize with our clients that they've underutilized their own first-party data that's being generated from their users on their properties, whether it be in mobile app or on the website. So really, more than anything, as a best practice, once you start solving for this problem, you'll quickly realize there's so much data that can really enhance and accelerate a lot of your marketing initiatives. And just jump to the next slide. So what I want to go over is just a few of the most common use cases where we see the data layer paying huge dividends. So the first stop normally in the data layer train is really around analytics. That's usually where the first time where you really need to think deeply and broadly about what data you collect and what data you want to leverage to manage your business. Oftentimes in most companies, your analytics solution, whether it be Google or Adobe or Webtrends or IBM, that's usually the main place you go as an organization to quickly understand your users, how they engage with your properties, how they interact with your marketing initiatives, and really try to get a better sense of their path and journey across your digital experience. So as you can imagine, you want to collect as much rich data as possible from every source possible, because ultimately you want to make sure your analysts are looking at a full view of your business, not just focus on a narrow sector of the data, but really give that platform all that data it needs to really drive value. So really this is where usually the first stop when it comes to data layers is really on how can I really enhance and really put your analytics packages on steroids, where you give it all the data it can possibly consume so you can drive the best potential for more insights, better segmentation, and better analysis. Next slide. The place where we often see the most ROI is actually in an area that Matt mentioned earlier, which is around optimization, A/B testing. This is where you have your best opportunity to actually act on data. So this example is actually from my past life at Symantec, where for those who don't know these screens, most of you probably don't. This is actually an example of what data is being passed to Adobe Target. Adobe Target is one of many A/B testing tools, no different than Maximize or Optimize or Monetate or many others. What I wanted to show here is just the simple difference in what more data can mean for your testing programs. So on the left, I think it's an out-of-the-box example of what's being collected by default by Adobe, which is typically there's a few attributes around browser screen, height, and a few different dimensions. But as you all know, these powerful tools are generic. They don't know about your particular business and what you care about as far as KPIs. On the right, you see an example where at Symantec we customized our data layer to include, I think, 50+ attributes around the page context, the user, product information, past history of the users in terms of relationship with us. So as you can see here, it's a night and day difference as far as what is possible now. So on the right, if that's your A/B testing program, you now have 50+ dimensions by which you can segment and target and personalize experiences. This is one of the key drivers of how at Symantec we were able to go from 0 tests, 1 test, 2 tests a month to hundreds. We were able to finally segment and groundly split out traffic and target, in a much richer detail, which is really the first step in optimization, is really providing the right experience to the right person at the right time. That's all going to be based on segmentation. Here is an example where we can actually take segmentation from analysis and bring it to life in a real-world, real-time scenario. Next slide. So while analytics and optimization are the two primary categories where you normally see immediate returns on the data layer, two emerging categories, which I think we're seeing a lot of customers kind of move towards, is first, as Matt mentioned, data management platforms, or DMPs. Historically, they've been primarily focused on helping brands create audiences to better target their advertising against in media. So oftentimes these platforms are built by taking your first-party data, typically your web clickstream activities, and enriching that with third-party data from other publisher-type providers, and then helping you create very targeted audiences. As you can imagine, for these platforms to be successful, they need to deeply understand your audiences. So again, this is where a data layer can quickly enable and accelerate your DMP initiatives, because ultimately at the end of the day, whether it's BlueKai or Adobe or Crux, or Aggregate Knowledge, or X+1. There's many DMPs out there. There's also many DSPs that also provide a DMP functionality like Turn or DataZoo. All those systems need to kind of classify all your site data into categories for audience building, whether it be types of users or what type of products they've been exposed to or product affinities they may show or behaviors they exhibit. Ultimately, these systems need to classify or create a taxonomy for your site, for your audiences. Again, with a data layer in place and a rich data layer in place, you can quickly build these taxonomies or traits for these classifications and also adjust them on the fly. So this gives you the flexibility to not only enable audience-based advertising through a DMP or DSP, but also allows you to provide a much richer audience classification from the get-go. So they can dramatically cut down on your time to market, as well as allow you to explore more advanced audience building and audience activation. So a key area we're seeing a lot of momentum around for data layers is really more of the DMP, DSP activation. And next slide. And as you can probably guess, the last area that we see a high demand for quality, real-time, granular data is around attribution. So now that you're doing analytics and personalization and media at scale, most marketing organizations want to understand, which of these channels and which of these campaigns ultimately are driving incremental value for my business. Am I getting the return on my spend? Am I touching customers in the right frequency across the right channels in the right sequence? So this is where we've seen a lot of a healthy explosion in really onboarding attribution solutions, whether that's in-house, where you're trying to do your own modeling, or whether you're buying off-the-shelf solutions like a Visual IQ or Google/Odometry or Convertro, or even Insight has attribution as well. There's a strong desire to really better measure and quantify the value of your media activities and your marketing overall. This is where, again, attribution is generically a great approach, but it needs a very rich, granular view of your data across campaigns and channels. So what we're seeing here again is for a lot of our clients, they're using this data layer to really drive faster execution and enhancements of their attribution approach. Because ultimately, each of these solutions, whether internal or off the shelf, requires very, very specific details around what you classify as a campaign or a conversion or success, whether that success be an order or a lead form or a certain type of engagement or activation of a mobile app. All that attribution awesomeness is dependent on getting the data right. If you have the data wrong, it could be making the wrong assumption about what campaigns, what channels are driving success at the end of the day. So ultimately, more than probably any other solution, attribution is most dependent upon getting the data right foundationally to really provide attribution insights for you ongoing. So really, those are the four key areas that we see as the most data intensive and has the greatest demands on data, especially from a digital standpoint, and benefit the most from data layers. But really, it should come at no surprise to you that data layer is not static in terms of it's just focused on your website or your web experience. Data layers are a strategy, and this strategy is evolving to kind of mirror and match what marketers are doing. So marketers are often advocating that it's not just about a single funnel or a channel. It's really about providing that ideal user experience across channels, across devices, really moving omnichannel. So what we're seeing here as well is for those clients who've onboarded and enabled data layers, they're now making that data layer omnichannel. I want to just quickly highlight, one of our recent customers who spoke at an Insight conference a couple of weeks ago in New York, Coke, one of the largest brands in the world. They are just doing a very simple omnichannel use case, which was, for many clients, data layer is something they feed an external party, like an external analytics tag or an external MBT tool tag. But we're also seeing is a lot of, Coke is just one example where they're taking that rich data layer and they're downloading a copy of that data for themselves. Because in the end, it's your data, it's so valuable that you should be building all of your internal best practices around, as much rich data as possible. So in their example, they're feeding this data back into their big data systems so they can provide a better omnichannel view of their business, provide better measurement, better reporting, and better analysis. So we're seeing customers not only use data layers to activate their tags, they're also getting a copy of that data themselves to drive more high-value enterprise use cases across, all their data sets. That's just one example. But in general, the next slide I think gives a good example of kind of showing maturity. So, most companies are not tackling omnichannel data layers overnight. This is actually a slide from our customer, United Airlines, that they presented at one of our conferences, which just kind of shows you their view of the data layer, how it's matured over time. So, like most of you, it's going to begin on your website. But you can quickly move to your mobile web and then mobile app. And then once you start, tackling and conquering those channels, we're also seeing then the next movement, logical movement, which is, let me also collect this valuable data from my media campaigns, in this case, display ads. And also onboarding and activating my CRM information, which is probably the most richest data that historically has been the most challenging to onboard and activate. So what we're seeing really is as our clients and as the industry in general starts trying to achieve that single view of the user across channels, we're seeing a lot more investment made to unlock data from all their touch points, not just their website. And that's paying huge dividends. So when you think about it, in terms of the approach, next slide, just when you think about the maturity of this, again, this single view kind of shows the typical website view of a data layer. And this is where you should ultimately, obviously start first, which is how can I bring all my rich data together and feed all my tags? There's so much potential just there with analytics, attribution, optimization, and many of the other use cases we spoke about earlier. But really, that should be the starting point for your program, not the end point. The next step, obviously, is how can I bring the same richness to mobile, right? So in the United example, the mobile app. How can I tap into rich data around their behavior or their interaction with my mobile app experience? Because ultimately, you want to drive, insights and optimization across multiple touch points, not just your website. So, again, the same concept applies to the mobile, where you're collecting data and feeding into various different technology tags, and then taking the next step, logical step. This is where, you start then bringing in your data points that are valuable around your offsite activities, whether it be email or display ads or even partner sites or other, properties you may own that are in different domains. We're seeing a lot of momentum around really building this data layer to be omni-channel by really trying to collect data from ads, things like impression count, frequency, what sites they were on, what audiences they belong to. Again, all valuable information that will help you better inform your analytics, your optimization, and your entire digital marketing strategy. And last but not least, and this is what I think Matt touched on with the service-side piece of it, which is the most valuable data you typically own for many brands is the historical information around your customers and your users' interaction with your brand historically. This could be transaction history. This could be past, engagement with your app. It could be, segmentation scores. It could also be data from third parties, like Matt mentioned, where you might be appending data on your CRM. The whole goal is you want to be able to bring all this wealth of data to bear in those real-time decisions. So when you're feeding your tag is not working off a siloed view of your user. It's not just thinking of your user as a session or a visitor. It's thinking of your user as a customer who has a rich, multi-year history with you, and based on your past analysis and segmentation, he or she may be best in market for an upgrade or a cross-sell, or maybe that person needs to be retained at all costs and there's risk of flight. If you don't have a full view of that data, you're making short-sighted decisions that could come back and haunt you. So really, this is what putting this kind of single view together helps you achieve that single view of the user, that real-time profile that we spoke about earlier, which is a critical path. We want to really deliver personalization at scale. So really, for many of our clients, it's the data layer on the website is the starting point. And what you see here is just an example of really where you want to take it, which is I want to be able to collect data from all my touch points, build that data around a user profile, and activate that data across all my market technology tags. Again, when you think about personalization, that's just not the job of your MBT tool or your target or maximizer. You ultimately want to orchestrate personalization across all your tagging technologies. So that means each one of your tags need to have this rich omnichannel view of the user. And this leads me to my final closing thoughts, which is the last place where we see our clients going is around the whole idea of using this data to help marketers build their technology stack. So I think next slide. I think we've all, for the last couple of years, been bombarded by these stories around, CMOs will be outspending CTOs on technology and marketing technology, and we've seen the explosion in different technologies that are point solutions. We've seen, overnight marketers are now, in the driver's seat of deciding which technologies they want to layer in to drive their, omni-channel personalization, customer journey capabilities. So the data layer becomes foundational to really drive this forward. So in this example seen here, these are 4 early customers of Insighten: Microsoft, Symantec, Sony, and United. And what I just want to kind of share with you is really how they are using the data layer not just to kind of activate tags, but more than anything, help them customize and build out their digital marketing stack. So on the next slide, you'll see a quick build out. These are actually slides that our customers presented at our last user conference. And what I want to show you is how each one's differently, but each customer, showcase how Insighten and the data layer we provide them was foundational to enabling their marketing technology stacks. So in each example here, you'll see it's drawn differently, but the goal is the same, is that this data and its data layer has become foundational to how they build out, their marketing capabilities and building, a stack of their technologies and capabilities together. So this is where I go back to, what's in it for marketing. At the end of the day, you're going to ultimately have to drive an omni-channel strategy around digital marketing and the offline marketing that really factors in every data point around your users and showcases how you can act on that data for insights, and more importantly, to drive better customized experiences back to each user in real time. So this is where I go back to the data layer is fundamental, not just for tags, but it's fundamental to drive your actual digital analytics solution and all your digital marketing strategies. And the last point before we close up is, next slide, is as you move into this world of personalization, Matt mentioned this briefly with the PII concern, but as you start driving these one-to-one experiences or one-to-many experiences and start truly personalizing the user experiences across channels based on their past interactions with your brand, it's becoming more and more important that brands also get ahead of the whole privacy and data governance concerns. You need to be good stewards of data on behalf of your users. And this is where you have to proactively, as marketers, think about that. So 2 or 3 years ago, privacy was primary concern of brands dealing internationally in the EU or Australia or other places that had more stricter compliance around data utilization for marketing. But we're now seeing a broader strategic approach where the chief privacy officer at your company, or maybe the chief security officer, is also making sure that you are good users of the data, that you're not doing utilizing data in ways that are going to violate privacy policies or just provide poor user experiences. The last thing you want to be for your brand is an article on AdExchanger about how you took a misstep with user data. So we're seeing a lot more investment being applied to proactively build out privacy capabilities. So that one of our offerings is actually around privacy, because to enable all these capabilities, we also need to provide protection. To make sure that marketers are doing right by their users and following certain guidelines and best practices set out by either the industry or your leadership. So personalization has really driven a second look at data governance as well as privacy. That's a capability that needs to kind of build out in parallel, so that as you provide these rich user experiences, you're also being respectful of your users and how they want you to use data on their behalf. Because that may change over time. It may change by different generations of users. So you need to have a very customizable and flexible platform that can also provide personalization and privacy that's segmented to each individual user or use case. So with that, we'll go into a quick summary. Again, I think Matt laid out most of this, these summary items in great detail, which really is, data is foundational to marketing. You can't be afraid of data any longer. It's something marketers need to really get full, deep understanding of, so they can really activate this across their different initiatives. Like the other point, you need to free your analysts to make the best decisions possible for your business, and that's going to come from richer data. And obviously, we want to be able to make sure you're following best practices as far as the design around data objects, and working with your IT resources to make sure you're partners in all this. Ultimately, your IT teams, should be the strongest enablers of this thing to happen. And under their guidance and under their approach, they can really unlock a lot of marketing potential and capabilities. And lastly, my last point really is that the data layer is not static to your website. It is an evolving strategy that's going to apply to all of your touch points, all of your channels. So you need to, when you think about data layer design and data governance, you need to think about what's the best way for my brand to really consume, collect, and act on all the data that's being generated from every touch point, from my brand to my users. And with that, I think we'll open up for questions.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, Matt. That was great. You guys gave a lot of food for thought, and there were questions coming in during your presentation. So I'm going to just start pulling them off and asking them, and you guys please jump in. The first question we got was, when you say client-side versus server-side, I'm still a little confused. Can you give examples of each?
Yeah, sure. So client side is really probably, when you think about web analytics, it's really probably what you've always been collecting. So this is things like the page names that you might define, marketing campaign IDs, how people come into the site, maybe tracking when a user clicks on a video, those sorts of things. Server side is other types of information that might be generated by the application. So as I talked about with user IDs, and James was talking about purchase history, data that comes in from third-party sources, integrating data from other applications. A lot of times that stuff is going to be collected on a server or database someplace, and so we would consider that to be server side. So I mean, hopefully that kind of gives some examples, maybe a little bit better perspective on that. I don't know, James, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think server side really is just the mechanical approach to how to expose the data to the data layer. But really, server side is kind of like the doorway to all the other data that you may know about a user that's not available in the client browser session. So this is where potentially, the best example is when someone authenticates, whether in your app or in, say, your website, at that moment, you probably are putting back a user ID. But that user ID is just a number. But it can be joined with, your CRM or your transactional database, and then from the server side, pull back so much more information around, again, their account status, their lifetime relationship with your brand or account. So server side really is just a method by which you can really, activate the richer data that often sits behind your databases or on your servers around that user, that you could, the wealth of information that can really unlock so many use cases. I mean, that's why it's so valuable to really bring this data to your other technologies like web analytics. So that web analytics can not just be focused on a session, but focus on a customer-centric view of analysis, for example, or for personalization, to personalize not just against, their click activity, but personalize against their full purchase history and their most likely next purchase, intent. So it's really just a great way to really broaden and really enhance your use cases.
Thanks, guys. This other question, I think, I understand that it was just a brief question. What if I can't get IT to help? So Matt, I know you talked a lot about, the need to really engage them, and are there some strategies you would have if that is a challenge in your environment?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that we definitely have laid out the reasons why you want to engage with IT. The fact is that data layers can exist solely client side. The new generation of tools that are out now and accessible through tag management systems allows marketers to operate more independently now. So although obviously having access to back-end data and that's always the goal, a lot of this information can be done separately, and I mean most of the solutions out there do have the ability to, including Inciton, to host data if you need to access things, and while it may not be as accurate as what you could get from the back end, you can definitely work around it. And again, we know, I mean, data layers have been existing client side for years now, and it's generally been client-side data all along. So what we can do is just you can always look for ways to expand that already existing structure there.
Okay, makes sense. The next question was around cost. So what does it cost to add a data layer if I don't have one?
Sure. So at the most basic level, data layers really aren't that expensive. It just requires coordinating developers to accomplish. So this might be your internal developers, or might be developers that, consultants or something like that. I'd say the first step is to just find out, like I was saying in the presentation, find out if you already have a data layer. I mean, a lot of times there's already something there that you can use. If you're using a TMS system, for example, TMS systems have their own proprietary data layers that you can make use of. So sometimes these things are already existing. You can make use of something that's already there. But there's no dollar amount that would be assigned to a data layer. I mean, I think that this is something that you start off with what's available, what's easy, and then over time you build it. As you discover the need for additional information, you go and you figure out how you're going to collect it and insert it. But I don't see this as being like the this isn't like the Ronco rotisserie thing, where you set it and forget it. This is where you cultivate it over time. You become more sophisticated over time, getting access to the data is the first challenge, and then once you have that, putting it into your data layer that already exists is usually relatively simple.
Yep. I mean, just to kind of jump on that, I mean, it's just the best practices in digital. It's not, TMS is like inside, make it much easier to kind of get it started and maintain it. But again, this should be, regardless of vendors you use or solutions you adopt, it's just the best practice going forward with, really digital architecture and design. No different than if you're going to create a website, you're thinking through, okay, HTML for my content, CSS for my style, JavaScript for my behavior, enabling that. Now, data layer is just another layer of that, which is, if I'm going to, collect and act on data from my digital property, then data layer has been adopted in that same fashion as CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. It's just seen as, an industry best practice to assemble your data once across your digital, property, and really provide a clean, consistent copy to all your different internal and external tags or systems. So yeah, the cost really is just some investment to really understand and make it a center of excellence within your organization over time, and obviously partner with IT and other folks to kind of, make them aware, and also potentially, add some additional skill sets to, better leverage best practices to your advantage.
Sounds good, thanks. I think we'll have time for one more question here. This is around the omni-channel, James, that you were touching on at the end there. The question is, you mentioned data layers going omni-channel. Can you expand upon those examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really just, as a marketer, thinking through what data is valuable to help me drive a better, right marketing experience. So this is where, oftentimes, in addition to your web property or mobile app, which is more of your, main digital property, we're seeing two efforts to really either bring in, I would say, your off-site, typically your media, display activities, or some other things around, your outbound push marketing, as well as bringing in your typically your user profile CRM view of the business. So those are the two other areas we're seeing, rapid, exploration of how to solve for that. And in terms of how to solve for that, I think Matt touched on, the two common paths, which is, you're going to work with IT when and where possible to kind of make the data available, across your channels. But oftentimes you're going to bring in, complementary solutions, probably from the vendor side, that can also, augment and enhance that. For example, Insighting allows you to both, track and capture data from your impressions and ads, as well as be able to onboard your CRM data. You might be able to explore some other options with other vendors around, activating certain, demographic data or psychographic data from other solutions. So really, we're seeing more than anything is a layering, where you're going to get some of this information from your IT department. They can make that available to you. And all the time, you're going to layer on other vendors that can provide a richer either data set that you want to act on that maybe is not under your control, or maybe help you onboard your CRM data, like in the case of Insighting, we can help you with that. But the whole goal is that, as a marketer, you want to be able to bring as much data as possible to the decision point. So we're seeing a lot of creativity as far as working with the IT department as well as working with vendors to kind of deliver data across channels and make it all live and available for the data layer to act on.
Great. Well, I think that's the top of the hour, so I want to say thanks again to our great speakers, Matt Coors from Numeric Analytics and James Niehaus from Insighten. As I mentioned, we will be sending the slides and the presentation, and you'll be able to contact the presenters if you want to for more follow-up questions. So thanks again for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.